Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of All Bodies, All Foods. Ashley here, and I'm joined with my co host, Sam, and our wonderful guest, Patrilie Hernandez. Patrilie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to chat with you both.
Yeah. So today we're definitely going to jump into the topic of food insecurity and eating disorders. However, before we do that, Patricia, we would love to learn a little bit more about you. I was on your website and just kind of reading through all of the various avenues that you work with and noticed that you're an educator, an advocate, a policy analyst, and a community builder. You work with supporting local and state governments on and other institutions, I would say, on being trauma informed and not harmful with the community. And so yeah, would just love to start with a little bit about yourself, Patricia. How did you get into this work? What's your background? And yeah, go from there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, I think when folks look at my resume and my past experience, they see definitely a smorgasbord of different roles, different sets of work, and different sectors that I've worked in. So I would say my professional experience with food really started actually in the culinary world.
Yeah.
I did grow up cooking, and I come from a line on my both sides of the family, but my mother's side from a line of really amazing cooks. She has 16 brothers and sisters, so we all learned how to cook for an army, basically.
Yeah.
But I started working in the professional food and hospitality industry shortly after I actually dropped out of college the first time. And so I went to school for a couple of years and decided that I needed to kind of get a little bit more grounded in what I wanted to do. So I started working in a restaurant, and
Mhm.
the executive chef there said I had a real knack for cooking and if I ever considered going to school for it. And I took that as,
Yeah.
yeah, sure. So I enrolled in my local community college back in St. Louis that has an excellent program. And I ended up getting an associate's in both hospitality management and also culinary training. So
Yeah.
I worked in the restaurant industry for about the first 6 years of my 20s,
Yeah.
moved from back of the house to front of the house. So doing more of the front-facing, customer-facing work. People said I talk too much, so that's where I was fit better. And because of that experience, I got a closer look of um, uh, to how food insecurity and houselessness really impacted quality of life and health for specifically the people in my neighborhood and the people
Mhm.
that worked in the area where the restaurant that I was working at was
Yeah.
located. And so next to this restaurant that I worked at, there was a nonprofit organization that served as a kind of like a communal feeding site, right, where we
Hmm.
prepare hot meals and folks can get social services there. But they also ran a workforce development program
Oh,
where they
wow.
actually trained people that were unhoused and also returning citizens that were formerly incarcerated in the culinary arts and how to work
Wow.
in the kitchen. And so that building was located right next to the restaurant. So I would see every day kind of folks coming in and out. And I learned a little bit more of the program. And it wasn't through that program, but I actually started volunteering as a chef instructor for another nonprofit organization that basically held cooking classes for children, families, and adults.
Wow.
On cooking on a budget because the majority of the participants receive SNAP benefits. So that was really my intro to the
Yeah.
world of food access and food insecurity. And it kind of took off from there. I became interested more in the nutrition piece, more in the public health policy piece. And so from St. Louis, it took me to Mobile, Alabama for 2 years, where I worked at a food bank. And then here in the District of Columbia, where I've been for 12 years. And
Hmm.
I have a total of 16 years kind of working in the food policy and food access space. That, really really, I think, was turned upside down again. It seems like every couple of years, something kind of informs my perspective even more of when I was diagnosed with an eating disorder in
Mhm.
2017. And that's where I realized I was holding a lot of really unhelpful thoughts and behaviors around what people's relationship to food should look like, what
Mhm.
so-called healthy eating looked like. Um,
Mhm.
that I really sought to divest from. So the past
Mhm.
8 years has really been focused on approaching public health and food access and food security primarily through a weight inclusive and trauma informed lens, just as
Mhm.
you mentioned, to make sure that we're not causing more harm to folks that are already struggling with food insecurity and with food access issues.
Yeah. Wow, Patrilie, I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation then with you today. And it sounds like your journey has really led you to the perfect
Yeah,
place. Like you're in the,
absolutely.
yeah, you're like everything kind of lined up for you to be in the right place at the right time with your advocacy work.
Yeah, I think so. I think that every kind of step I took in my life, right, led me to growth
Yeah.
in my career, but also in my personal life and in my personal politic, and how I choose to engage in advocacy work in local
Hmm.
grassroots organizing. So it's already been so every step has really been critical to my evolution of who I am today and what and how I choose to talk about different issues that are impacting my community.
Yeah, and I would say so Sam and I, when we're kind of like planning for these seasons, we're definitely researching and looking up different relevant, topics that are obviously affecting, our listeners
Mhm.
and the clientele that we work with. And I think I saw your information. I think you were speaking for Project Heal, if
Mhm.
I remember correctly. And I saw your information on LinkedIn and I was like, we need to have them on. I would really love to get some information from you. So thank you. Yeah, we're just excited that you're here.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been kind of sharing knowledge and trying to bridge
Yeah.
um, two different fields, which is the eating disorder treatment
Mm-hmm.
and like prevention field, with the public health nutrition field,
Yes.
specifically around food access. Because in my personal experience doing specifically food insecurity policy work and just like community health work, anecdotally, after I learned about what eating disorders kind of looked like,
Yeah.
um, specifically for populations and for communities that are not typically represented in
Yes.
eating disorder treatment spaces, I
Yeah.
started to see a lot of that within my community, especially those that were experiencing or previously experienced chronic food insecurity,
Yeah.
seeing a lot of the same symptoms, and in some cases, seeing what might be, that I'm not a clinical doctor, so I can't provide like a diagnosis, but opportunities for folks to learn more about eating disorders and talk to their doctors about uh, what they were feeling and what they were
Yes.
doing to their bodies, right? Because historically, eating disorders and eating disorder prevention hasn't really targeted like the communities that I belong to. So,
Yeah.
just to be specific, because folks, I'm not sure if they'll be able to see me, but I identify as I've always been higher weight, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am a lead. I am a Latina, multiracial person of color, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in predominantly Black, brown, and like Latina um, neighborhoods, right? That had people with bodies very similar to mine, and eating disorders and disordered eating were never a topic that was broached, by our health providers, by our doctors, even in like community health work.
Mm.
So being introduced to this world, right, really helped me see the gaps in the public health nutrition space, specifically around food access and food security work.
Yeah. You know,
Patrilie, you're
yeah, I just wanted to say real quick, what you're doing here reminds me of Dr. Nadine Burke when
Mhm.
she discovered ACEs and like how or how ACEs kind of impacted our different communities. So I think that this has the ability really to be huge and impactful and influential in the way that we work with communities across the spectrum. So just wanted to say thank you. Sorry, Sam. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, Patrilie, you do such important work. Food insecurity is such an important topic. It's relatively new in the research when you sort of
Mhm.
look at eating disorders as a whole.
Mhm.
I didn't really even hear about the intersection of food insecurity and eating disorders until, oh my gosh, what was it? 2016 or something like that?
Yeah,
Mhm.
pretty new.
Yeah. And so I thought maybe for our audience, we could start with the basics.
Yeah.
What is food insecurity? How would you define it? And
Yeah.
maybe we can learn a little bit about the history of food insecurity in this country.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's important to provide a background because food insecurity in this country. So my area of expertise lies around domestic food insecurity. So the way that we define and we assess and we treat so-called food insecurity looks different than across the rest of the globe. So the USDA defines food insecurity as, quote, the limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or limited or uncertain ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. So here they say socially acceptable ways, so that's most likely by purchasing food, right? Or by
Mhm.
getting food that is free of cost. So you might hear me go back and forth. I try to be more distinctive because I understand the audience it might be new. Might like this might be a newer concept for them, but in policy spaces, we're pretty interchangeable between using food insecurity and hunger. So, for example, I worked for a policy think tank where we addressed anti-hunger through federal food policy. But there is a distinction between food insecurity and hunger, right? So hunger is the psychological and biological condition that results from food insecurity. Right. So
Mhm.
hunger is a potential consequence of food insecurity that might, because you have a prolonged involuntary lack of food, results in feelings of discomfort, illness, weakness, and pain that like goes beyond the usual hunger pang, right? So you're feeling
Mhm.
this is like there's a physiological condition that persists because you don't have access to food. So in the United States, um, food insecurity is assessed on a spectrum, right? So um, it it can range anywhere from high food security, where an individual or a household reports zero problems or no limitations when it comes to accessing food that they need to fully nourish themselves. And that goes all the way down to very low food insecurity, where in addition to having kind of constant anxiety over not having a variety of high quality and palatable food, to feed your family, you're also facing a overall general food shortage, right? And it's so much so that your eating patterns are disrupted and you have to consistently reduce your food intake. Um, so there's something called the Household Food Security Report, which has been published by the USDA's Economic Research Service. Um, annually since 1995, and it has shown since then that there has been a statistically significant increase in overall food insecurity and especially low food security, right? With
Wow.
13.5% of US households reporting that they had low or very low food insecurity in 2023. So we're looking at over 1 in 10 households in this country.
Yeah.
And so you might be like, well, that's not that high, right? Like 1 in 10, sure. But but a couple of things about that, because we live in a country where we produce way more food than is actually consumed.
Mm.
Hmm.
So in fact, upwards of over 40% of our food supply is wasted. So from a production standpoint, there's no reason people should be experiencing food insecurity in this country. And there are certain groups who are more at risk for like for food insecurity. So for example, of these 13.5% households, the vast majority of them are households with children, right?
Hmm.
You are also at higher risk to experience food insecurity if you live in a household that identifies as Black, non-Hispanic, Latine, or Native American.
Hmm.
Seniors are at disproportionate risk to experience food insecurity. Those that identify as LGBTQIA plus, and those that have disabilities, right? And what we see is that these groups have also been disproportionately impacted by policies, by systems, and by structures that have historically excluded them or have minimized access to resources and opportunities that allow them to have more decision-making power and body autonomy.
Wow. All
Thank
right.
you so much for all of that information. A lot of it is, I'm sure, will surprise our audience to discover. Would you describe this as a public health crisis?
Absolutely. And historically, right, food insecurity and food scarcity, because of our system, or like because of our food system and because of our economic system and because of different policies throughout our history, people have always experienced food scarcity, right? And it's been
Hmm.
specifically targeted to certain groups of people. So during the civil rights era, there was a renewed interest, or not a renewed interest. There was an increased interest in addressing food scarcity through a policy perspective, right? And so that's why we start seeing a lot of targeted intervention specifically through federal nutrition programs emerged during the late 1960s to really kind of mitigate a lot of the adverse health effects of food insecurity, right? There was a lot more research being done around, not just the biological or the physiological impact, but also the impact on learning, the impact on development, the
Right.
impact on mental health. And so this has been so much so, and we are seeing, more and more research show about the impacts of the negative impacts of of food insecurity, is that it is named as a driver of health. So
Wow.
when we look at key health outcomes,
Yeah.
we see that a person's food access or a person's level of food access really determines how they thrive, right?
Hmm.
And so because of that, it has become a key focus of public health research, but also public health practice, because this is something that is solvable, right?
Yeah.
Because we produce enough food, so it's not a
Mm.
so it's not a production issue. It is a policy issue. It is
Mm.
a systems issue. So it definitely has become a key focus of public health practice.
I'm so happy to hear that because
Yeah.
it seems like in this culture, the onus is always pushed on the individual to make yourself healthier.
Mhm,
This
Yeah.
concept of healthism.
mhm,
And food insecurity is one of those social determinants of health that
mhm,
just don't get talked about enough.
Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah.
And the focus becomes on what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat. But instead, we should really be talking about, do we have enough to eat? Do people have enough to eat?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I feel like, right, we very much work in our silos, right? Because I specifically work like an anti-hunger policy that had, that was all that I was surrounded with, right? And I was very aware of how for example, how our federal budget allocates
Hmm.
appropriations towards federal food nutrition programs, right? That are key pieces of how people are able to support themselves. Um, during times where they're financially struggling, right? So I knew of the importance of it, right? But entering spaces, for example, like the eating disorder prevention and treatment
Hmm.
space, I think I had assumed for a long time that this was on their radar, right? That if we're doing treatment for conditions where we are looking at folks to nourish themselves as a path to recovery, right? But we aren't assessing if when they go home or when they're or before they got to the treatment center or when
Yeah.
they leave the treatment center to make sure that they have access to the resources they need
Yeah.
to buy food, to purchase or to prepare food, right? I
Mhm.
think I just had always kind of assumed that was part of the infrastructure of treatment.
Yeah.
But then going through my own treatment, right? I was an intensive outpatient for 6 months, and then learning more about the treatment field as a whole, I quickly learned that that wasn't the case, and that was actually pretty surprising.
Yeah. That does seem to be quite a large gap there, um, between the two industries. And I'm thinking about, I don't know. I can only speak from my experience, Patrilie. I live in the South, really between Tennessee and Kentucky, and I remembered after COVID, when COVID was happening, that actually the school district where I was living was busing around daily meals to the students. And really that was so that the kiddos would continue to have
Mhm.
access to food, because as we now know, that that does indicate whether or not they can thrive in the school environment, whether or not they can pay attention, as if they're nourished or not. And since then, what I've seen in the communities that I've lived in is that both breakfasts at school and lunches at school can be provided at no cost
Mhm.
to those folks that need that. Is
Yeah.
that something that came out from this kind of like food insecurity work?
I'm
Do you
so
know?
glad.
Yeah,
I'm so glad you brought that up because, interestingly enough, right, when I
yeah,
was sharing about what the rates were of food insecurity over the years since they
yeah.
started publishing this annual report in the mid 90s, is that we have seen a significant increase, right, over the
Hmm.
years, except for the
Hmm.
years of 2020,
Mm.
2021, and the first half of 2022. Why is
Wow.
that? It is because with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were unprecedented investments into our infrastructure and into our program aimed at reducing food insecurity. So
Yeah,
basically, in a nutshell, you brought the example around the bus being able to
yeah.
deliver food to families. Schools were granted a waiver to be able to do that. Right. And they were
Okay.
given extra funding to be able to make that happen logistically. And so for those years, 2020, 2021, first half of 2022, food insecurity in this country actually dipped to under 10%. And we have not
Wow.
seen that in
Wow.
decades. And then
Wow.
as soon as that funding um,
Mm.
was rescinded in May of 2022, we see those numbers creeping up again, especially over the
Really?
past year and a half, where we have seen a drastic increase in the pricing of food because of inflation. We are now at historic levels of food
Wow.
insecurity. So that just shows is that where when there is public in public investment, we see the impact, right?
Wow.
But but unfortunately, we're not only back where we started, we're in a worse place.
Yeah. Is that part of what you do in your advocacy work then, is to show these numbers to people, like educate people on this so that hopefully we can get more policy generated?
Yeah, so I'm just very well versed in it because I worked in that space. I'm not currently working in that space anymore.
Okay. Yeah.
But I am very well connected to the research. I am very well connected to the trends. So I am an advocate in, like, in the sense that I always have these numbers kind of on hand because I think it's really important for folks, like especially like in other sectors,
Yeah.
to be aware of. But there are some wonderful organizations that are leading this work, that have been leading this work, and do excellent research and do excellent advocacy around this very topic.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I have another question for you. I'm going
Sure.
to read it because I want to make sure I get it right because I pulled some information from your
Mhm.
website. So you mentioned that you specialize in transforming organizational culture, policies, practices, and programs that impact mental, emotional, social, spiritual, and physical well-being of people holding systemically marginalized identities. Curious if you can speak more about this work and how does food insecurity, you've answered some of this, but how
Mhm.
does it show up in the food or in the advocacy work that you do? And does it show up in a larger capacity for those within the systemically marginalized identities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Sam, I think that you pointed this earlier is that, like in a lot of spaces when we talk about health, when we talk about well-being, um, mainstream conversations often portray them as individual like responsibilities, right?
Right,
It is up to us. We have full control over the choices we make, and because of the choices we make, that determines whether we are healthy or we are unhealthy.
right.
And when we kind of center this narrative in these types of conversations, is we overlook the collective dimensions of health and well-being that are influenced by the built environment, influenced by policies and other social drivers, right? So I work with nonprofit organizations, with public health institutions, local state government, and eating disorder treatment centers, right? Because I recognize that they hold substantial power when it comes to shaping the environment, the systems, and structures that enable people to thrive, right? Whether it's in their
Mhm.
recovery, whether it's when they go back to the communities that they are a part of. So the work that I have pivoted to after all these years of
Mhm.
experience, I do have a master's of science in nutrition, but I don't do one-on-one health coaching. I don't do nutrition counseling, but really, I feel like my work is called to help work towards the collective change, right?
Yeah,
To
yeah.
equip organizations and institutions and providers with the tools and the strategies and the frameworks that they need to build kind of more sustainable, justice-centered approaches to improving the health of the people they serve, that take account the many dimensions of well-being. So, we use a library of cross-disciplinary tools because I started out in culinary school, but then I went back to school, have an
Mm.
undergrad in cultural anthropology, specifically around food and health, my
Mhm.
master's. And so I draw from all of these
Mhm.
disciplines, right? To really equip folks, right, uh, with what they need in order to make these changes for their staff, whether it's their board of directors, for their patients, for the communities they serve, etc. And then how this influences um, my work in food insecurity, I think that when we look at a broader level, right, having access to a variety of food that one, you like to eat, 2, reflects your cultural and your personal identity.
Yeah.
3, nourishes you in the ways that you need and also choose to be nourished, is a key driver of health, right? And I
Yeah.
think we like talked about that earlier. And the thing about this food access piece is that it's not mostly it is not by individual choice, right? It is determined by
Right.
policy.
Right.
It's determined by economic systems, and it also takes into account who is most likely to experience historical discrimination, and systemic exclusion, right? So because of all these factors, this is a systemic issue, right? And so I aim to work with organizations that want to work towards this systemic collective change.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Patrilie.
Patrilie, we wanted to do this episode for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which is that food insecurity is a risk factor for eating disorders and disordered eating.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I'm not sure if clinicians, providers out there are actually screening
Yeah.
for food insecurity or a
Yeah,
history of food insecurity. And so I was hoping we can learn more, if you could talk more about the food insecurity screener and how it's used,
absolutely.
and whether or not it does it identify mental health needs. Maybe we
Mhm.
can talk more about how food insecurity impacts mental health also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. And I will say that it goes both ways, right? Where in the eating disorder world, um, screening for food insecurity is not a current practice that is widespread. On the other side, in community health interventions, specifically around food security, disordered eating screeners are not part of like common practice.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think there are opportunities for both, right? And
Hmm.
Yes.
there is a need, I think, for both sectors to be working together in this space
Yeah.
because and so basically, but I'm talking from the community health side, screening for food insecurity over the years, um, uh, we have been able to develop a validated screening tool. And this was actually started by one of my uh, uh, former employers, the Food Research Action Center, and they worked with the American Academy of Pediatrics to develop something called the Hunger Vital Sign, right? And so
Okay.
basically, it is a way to assess individual and household food insecurity in clinical settings, right? So in the doctor's office.
Hmm.
And so basically, it is a two-statement or a two-question screening tool that could be done very quickly to measure a patient or client's concerns about access to food, right? So people that are screened, they respond to the following statements with either often true, sometimes true, or never true. So the first statement is within the past 12 months, we worried whether our food would run out before we had money to buy more. Right? The second uh, statement is within the 12 months, we had food, or within the past 12 months, the food we bought didn't last and we didn't have enough money to get more. So these are very two basic questions that
Mm.
could be included as part of assessments. But there is a slightly longer form with six statements called the U.S. Household Food Security Survey module that folks can choose to ask. But what we struggle with in especially community health clinical settings is time, right? So
Mm.
very, very often clinicians are pressed for time. So these two screeners have been validated and they've been translated also into other languages to really get to whether or not someone is experiencing food insecurity. And a lot of the times, these two questions are embedded into a larger SDOH screener, which is a social determinants of health screener, where the clinician also asks questions around housing, around, if they're experiencing domestic violence or other forms of like interpersonal violence, things like that. So in, in a lot of like community health in a lot of community health settings, federally qualified health centers, you see the screening embedded into the larger SDOH screener, but there's nothing asking about disordered eating, right?
Mhm.
There is nothing asking about whether people skip meals, whether people have weight and shape concerns, etc. And I find this really interesting, right? Because they talk about in the community health space of how important mental health is, right?
Yeah.
And we see that mental health and food security have a bi-directional relationship. So what do I mean by that? We meaning that food insecurity is a risk factor for developing or worsening severe mental illness, right?
Mhm.
Like across the spectrum. And those with struggling that are already struggling with mental illness have a higher risk of experiencing food insecurity. Okay.
Mm.
And the relationship between poor mental health and food insecurity impacts people of all ages, right? Starting from children. There are decades of research that have linked childhood food insecurity
Yeah.
to a number of negative health outcomes. In addition to overall poor health, it's been also attributed to reduced immune system functioning, asthma, anxiety, depression, developmental and cognitive delays, poor concentration, memory, mood, and also motor skills, right? That impact learning, impact, behavioral issues, things like that. But it not only so it impacts children, but it is just as impactful on our seniors, right? Where there is data from a poll from the University of Michigan that revealed that elderly adults, so those between the ages of 50 to 80, experience fair or poor mental health, or that experience poor mental health are more likely to experience food insecurity. So mental health and food insecurity are very much intertwined.
Mhm.
And I would assume that that also falls under eating disorders. If you're struggling with an eating disorder, because a lot of them also have co-occurring conditions,
Right.
um, food assessing for food insecurity might be a key mitigation factor.
I
This,
agree.
yeah, this is kind of, feel a little bit guilty for saying this, and also it's like blowing my mind right now. I'm thinking about my own um, intake screening tools and how I can begin to incorporate these questions, and something that I perhaps have had the privilege to not have had to think about in the past.
Mm.
I'm curious, Patrilie. So I was reading some research around this
Mhm.
and found a study that was done in 2017. I think
Mhm.
it was a look at multiple studies, but they were looking at food insecurity, and they labeled four different, um, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, um, four different,
Diagnoses.
yeah, or on the spectrum there were four
Mhm.
different like categories on the
Mhm.
spectrum. Okay, and so the one that was the most severe form of food insecurity was the one where both the child and the adult at home reported
Correct.
hunger. Okay.
Correct. Mhm.
So what they found is that the children belonging to the most severe form of food insecurity group reported significantly more binge
Mhm.
eating,
Mhm.
overeating, and night eating
Mhm.
than those experiencing the other levels of
Mhm.
food insecurity. So
Mhm.
you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many implications here between food insecurity and disordered eating or eating disorder. And I'm curious what you think this means for our children. How do we best support them in this avenue? Um, if the lunch thing has gone away with the
Mhm.
schools, what are other areas that we can support them with?
Absolutely. And yes, you're right. So you're referring to the very low level of food insecurity. And
Yeah.
as I kind of previously mentioned, with that level, right, you not only have the anxiety around not having enough food, um, food shortages are so consistent in that you're reducing your food intake. And so what happens
Yeah.
normally in households with children is that when adults are, when they are experiencing food insecurity, they will make sure the child and or children will have enough to eat first, right? And so
Yeah.
so they will reduce their own intake in order to make sure that the child has enough to eat. But there are households in this country where there is so little food where even the child isn't even getting enough, right?
Yeah.
And so in these types of households, we do see that the children and also adults cope by engaging in disordered eating behaviors, which can set the stage for the development of a full-blown eating disorder later on. Right. So the body of research is small, but it's growing, right?
Yeah.
As Sam mentioned, really started the body of research really started becoming more dense around 2016, right?
Hmm.
Which has grown since then. Just in the
Hmm.
past 3 years,
Hmm.
there has been a lot more. Uh, there have been a significant higher number of studies done around this, and so the interesting thing is that the study that you referenced from 2016 that recorded the relationship between children that are experiencing these low levels of food insecurity and binge eating. Since then, we have seen that the association between food insecurity um, and binge eating disorder is the same as bulimia. So we
Yeah.
actually see kind of parity among those two. And households with the lowest level of food insecurity also tend to engage in significantly higher disordered eating behaviors, things like
Hmm.
dietary restraint, um, and a lot of internalized weight control or weight uh, control concerns, right? And I think it's because there's this kind of, I don't know exactly how to phrase it in one word, but this is just another reason of why folks in the eating disorder world need to be talking to folks that are in in the food in the food insecurity space, because what we're seeing is that a lot of the interventions for food insecurity, especially ones that are nutrition focused, focus more around yes, eating, but also healthy eating, because you often see there is a
Yeah.
comorbidity with food insecurity, chronic disease rates, specifically those like specifically type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, right? And a lot of those are co-occurring with higher body weight, right?
Hmm.
So when we see a lot of these interventions, we see that they are nutrition focused, wanting people to eat, but to eat healthy. But a lot of this messaging also includes like reducing your calories, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
engaging in where in an eating disorder treatment center would qualify as concerning behaviors, right? And so what you see is that a lot of these folks that are experiencing food insecurity are also being told that what they're eating is wrong, how much they're
Right.
eating is wrong,
Right.
right? And so you start to see these elevated concerns about body shape and about weight status while
Mhm.
still struggling with food insecurity, right? So
Right.
this leads to a lot of, I think, complicated body image issues,
Yeah.
and to uh, possibly the development of like compensatory behaviors
Yeah.
Right.
as a way to manage body weight. But these behaviors increase as your level of food insecurity also gets worse.
Wow.
So yeah, there's a lot of potential for like complications there that just show how important it is for these two areas to be addressed at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. But Patrilie, as a community member, we have a lot of listeners out there that might be wondering, what can we do to help? What can we do to combat food insecurity? Because it can feel really discouraging.
Mhm. Yeah, I think especially now in this current point in time, we're looking at early of 2025, um, where a lot of the access to like federal nutrition programs are like currently under scrutiny, right? We have
Right.
deep cuts being made to first line defenses against food insecurity, things like SNAP, things like childhood
Right.
nutrition programs, things like WIC,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's also understanding that I think one of the challenges that people with food insecurity face, and it's not just actually physically accessing the food, right? Or like having the financial capital to access food, right? I think it requires infrastructure. You need because for example with SNAP, so you aren't allowed to purchase what's called ready-made food, right? So like hot food from the salad bar, or
Oh,
and so you can't get food from like restaurants, right? So like that's a huge stipulation. So the idea of SNAP is that you buy um uh raw food, right, to be able to prepare in your
mm,
home. But what if somebody doesn't have access to a kitchen? On
right.
top of that, they
Or
have
the
access to a kitchen, but they don't have
right.
the equipment,
Yeah.
Right.
right?
Or they work two jobs and they just don't have the time to
Time.
prep
Right.
and prepare
Right.
and
Absolutely.
right.
And it takes a level of skill, right? Because you don't want to burn your house down. But like
Hmm.
also, right, you want to have like a certain amount of knowledge, right? That if you're trying to feed your family a nourishing meal with, vegetables, meat, etc., what are ways that you could provide that you can prepare them safely
Yeah.
and in a way that your family will actually eat. So I think when it comes to solutions, right, we really have to look at um, uh, what can be possible from a policy perspective,
Yeah.
right? Ashley, I think you were mentioning something about children having access to a free lunch and breakfast,
Yeah.
no matter who you are, right?
Yeah.
And that is actually part of a large policy campaign called Universal School Meals. States that have championed universal school meals, meaning that no matter your socioeconomic background, you have access to a free and a nourishing breakfast, lunch, and snack in a school setting, has led to in like very significant in improvements in learning, in
Hmm.
child health, mental
Hmm.
health, physical health, right? Um, Also, right, looking at, because we're currently facing with high cost of food, instead of cutting SNAP, we should actually be adjusting SNAP to our current um, inflation rates,
Yeah.
right? Because the
Yeah.
thing is people are spending more money, but they're getting less for their dollar,
Yeah.
right? So like
Yeah.
what are ways that we can make adjustments based on that? Another thing, right, is around Medicaid, right? We are currently experiencing cuts to this essential healthcare program. And these healthcare programs, like specifically Medicaid, can be a great channel to expand access through food, through like food as medicine programs where folks can get a prescription
Yeah.
to foods, right? Where
Yeah.
they can get a produce box delivered to them, right?
Yeah.
And I am my approach about food is, give folks a variety of foods that are tasty to them, that
Hmm.
are essential to their cultural identity, and that have like different kinds of like nourishment, and people will be able to make the choices that they need to fit their life circumstance, right?
Yeah.
And so offering Medicaid, um, having that covered like by like public health benefits can improve people's access to food in a monumental way, right? But other policy um, interventions that yes can be done on a federal level, but also at your state and your local level, right? Are folks being paid a living wage, right,
Hmm.
for the work that they do? Is housing affordable?
Hmm.
Right? Those are going to make significant impacts in a
Yeah.
person's ability to buy and also prepare food for them and for their families. In terms of grassroots solutions, right, things like food banks and food pantries, they can be a short-term solution, but they really are a band-aid, right? We do
Yeah.
need to make significant investments into our infrastructure, into our systems, as a way to fully address food insecurity. That I think grassroots solutions might be able to move the needle from very, very minutely, but it's really these large scale these large scale investments that are going to be the key factor.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I feel like honestly, just starting this conversation today, and not that we're starting it today, but like having it, putting it out there, educating all of us in our various industries so that we know how to move forward with this, so we know the right questions to ask, we know how to advocate. I mean, this just feels so good. Like I'm feeling quite inspired, actually. I'm like, ooh, um, how can I support these initiatives? And even like, I don't know, like I'm thinking of getting connected with a local nonprofit and even
Yeah,
offering like free cooking classes with like basic foods that somebody might be, given at a food
absolutely.
shelter or something, like that just it sounds really cool to be able to kind of lean into that work and
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, no, I think like as a provider, as a dietitian, as like the folks that are listening to this podcast that work
yeah,
in that work like in the professional space, there are definite strategies that you could
yeah,
incorporate into your practice. And I think like you named one of them, Ashley, which is like assessing what's available in your community, right?
yeah.
Because what I find when I work with providers, and even on the community health like in the clinical space, is that okay, we have these screeners, but
Hmm.
then what do we do? What do we
Right,
do when
right,
someone um uh when they're affirmative, right? Like
right.
when they do have food insecurity, then what? And so that's why it's incredibly important. I think this is more important than the screener actually is to make sure that you're creating a solid referral network. Right,
Yeah,
is that you
yeah,
know what is happening within your community, ways to address food insecurity, whether it's a food bank, a food pantry, a mutual aid network, social service organization that can get them connected to different forms of like federal benefits, right? That's going to be a key piece of you as an individual being able to take steps to really make an impact on the clients, patients you serve.
yeah.
Patrilie, thank you so much for coming on today. You've given us so much really important education. You've inspired us to get out there and
Yeah.
start doing some of this work. And we're so grateful for you today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for offering the opportunity for me to share about this important topic.